Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1. News drama on Flexi-Wings continues with a new technical directive coming into place in just a few rounds' time. That does not mean the start of the season. Interestingly enough, the FIA have drafted regulations and a technical directive that will come into force for the Spanish Grand Prix in a few races' time. Why they're not doing it at the start of the season? What does this mean for the top teams, especially McLaren, who paved the way on this over the last season or so, although McLaren apparently are in favour of exactly this move. What does it mean for the competitiveness of the championship? Red Bull have been one of the key teams trying to catch up in this domain recently. That may not be the case for too much longer. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. First of all, an interesting assessment here from Adrian Newey. He went into some more detail on exactly what went wrong with Red Bull in the recent past, because he made it quite clear during 2023 he became aware that there were problems emerging with the 2023 car, with the RB19. Max could handle it, Checo most certainly couldn't. And he made it quite clear to the team, as he said, it was something that I started to become concerned about, that effectively Max's talent was paving over the cracks that were building at Red Bull, and Red Bull weren't concerned. Newey says that I was concerned about it, not many other people seemed to care. From what I could see from the outside, I don't know, the guys at Red Bull, this is no criticism, but perhaps through lack of experience, they kept going in that same direction. The problem became more and more acute. Even Max found it then difficult to drive. So this, I think, aligns with what Newey said yesterday when we heard him say, look, it would have been not true to myself had I stayed at Red Bull, which kind of implies that Newey felt like he was, at least to some extent, disrespected, really, because he was saying, hey, this is a problem. They said, you're what? Well, they didn't say this, but, maybe the implication was, you helped us in the past, Newey, but we know what we're doing now, we can handle it. And then it turns out that, Newey made some fair points. Thought that was pretty interesting. A couple of other interesting developments as well. Christian Horner gave his thoughts on Johnny Herbert getting removed as a steward. We know that they got rid of him the other day. Herbert said, it is what it is. And there was a feeling that his duties as a media pundit interfered to some degree with his ability to be entirely impartial when it comes down to making decisions in the stewarding room. And even Horner says it's got nothing to do with Max, but it is the right decision. You can't have stewards working in the media. You don't have it in any other professional sport. Totally inappropriate. Can't have a foot in both camps. As much as I don't agree with lots of what Horner says, I do get it in this case. I totally understand why teams would be like, hey, this doesn't really, it's not the most sensible idea, I would say, to have this happen. And he's not wrong that in other sports this isn't usually the case. But for some reason, F1 does many a thing different to what you might expect from regular sports. This, an interesting development at Mercedes. Valtteri Bottas is going to be their reserve driver. And, do you think there's anything in this? Because Ferrari, the engine that Ferrari had, was driven by Bottas in his Sauber last year, his Alfa Romeo before that. So Bottas has experience now with the Ferrari engines. Of course, not an engine that Russell will be driving, but maybe there's some insights that Bottas has gained that Mercedes could benefit from to some degree. Thought it was an interesting, because I've never really heard this discussed that much before, a driver having experience with another engine manufacturer coming into a certain team and giving that team, high performance powertrains at Mercedes, certain insights in terms of how to approach things. But that was what Mercedes had to say. But speaking of George Russell, he's of course the head man at the GPDR, the Grand Prix Drivers, or the GPDA, the Grand Prix Drivers Association. And there was talk about this because the FIA, we know that they've put those new guidelines into place. You can't swear, you'll get a €40,000 fine. You swear again, you'll get a suspended 1 month ban, you get a €120,000 fine if you do it a third time, like all this stuff happening. And Alex Wirtz says, who's I think also a track designer, but he works with these guys, and he says there was no consultation. We have read that through the media. Could be room for improvement that we are working out together. So pretty interesting just to say, whatever this party is being represented by, that, no consultation in effect here, which is obviously a pretty big deal. This was another thread that caused a little bit of controversy today in Formula 1 on the cost cap. I do mention this from time to time, and it is clearly an issue, but the cost cap in Formula 1 is problematic in a number of regards. It may have helped the sport, and it may well continue to help the sport. I think there's a good case to be made for that. The problem is that the drivers, the top 3 members of staff, they don't get counted for the cost cap. So you can pay Adrian Newey whatever you want. $1 million a year, 100 million a year, $1 billion a year. It doesn't matter, nobody cares. But the problem is that there's a maximum payance that is possible within the rules elsewhere. And the problem with this is, that effectively what it means is lots of engineering staff that aren't going to be in the top 3 earners, they just get squeezed really hard. And this is what Blake here says, who used to be involved in Formula 1 in some capacity. But he says that with a conversation with a recruiter for an F1 race engineer gig, their maximum salary was less than I was making last year as a part-time performance engineer in WEC. Why aren't the team bosses advocating harder for increased cost cap to accommodate increased cost of living and inflation? Because the teams are profitable. So I thought that was particularly interesting as a story, really, because it's very clear that these guys working in Formula 1 right now are getting rinsed. Like, there's lots of people working in F1, you'd think they're on nice salaries. They're not, largely due to the cost cap in some regards. You could argue increase the cost cap and increase the amount of money that they can spend on staffing, but it is not exactly an unintended consequence, but I would say an inevitable consequence, because many of these teams, they're still spending what they used to spend. They're just spending it in different ways, right? They'll spend more money on driver salaries and on salaries of some of their guys that they can spend more on, and they will spend less on, the people that maybe really make the difference from a day-to-day level. So tweet your thoughts on that. Confirmation as well that the RB21 will be driven for the first time on the 25th of February, so shortly before pre-season testing. Same as what Mercedes are doing. No shakedown in Silverstone. Reveal the car on the 18th of February at the launch event in London. Take it straight over there to Bahrain, although it won't even be the same car they show in London. It'll be a mock-up of the previous car. You guys know how it is. And then they'll turn up, of course, to Bahrain, and we'll see what the car actually looks like on track. But let's talk about some of the drama with the Flexi-Wings and the state of the sport at the moment. Hamilton, of course, had his crash in Barcelona testing. We think he went off right about here in the background down the Man Straight. Again, a couple of images coming through. Maybe Jezza Clarkson has his thoughts on that. But look, we talked about that the other day. What we will discuss in some detail, though, here is the new technical directive. Now, there was a big conversation last year about flexible wings. What were they going to do about them? Were they going to clamp down on them? What was the potential solution going to be? Because we saw, the most egregious example, of course, was at, Baku, right, where we could see what was described as mini DRS on the McLaren. And shortly after this, it was admitted basically by McLaren. They said, hey, all right, we won't do that anymore. And we are hoping that maybe the FIA will be generous to us in the future when we come to them and say, hey, we want this to change. We want that to change. But the front wing flexibility was still a massive point of conversation. And even we're talking back in, this was September really, I think, when Ferrari were talking about them bringing their own flexible front wing, which of course they did, and it seemed to help them out. It was actually an upgrade they brought, which was not have to be declared, because it was the same exact parts, but made of a different compound, which was more flexible. And it was beneficial because under high-speed loads, it was able to generate good downforce, but under straight-line speed conditions, it was able to flex into a position where it was generating less drag. That's the crux of the matter with flexible wings, and the wing is always going to be flexible to some degree. Red Bull messed around with it for years, but obviously over the last year, really, it was McLaren paving the way on flexibility of front and rear wings and the performance advantages that can provide. So it was a massive talking point because lots of these wings were pretty much outside of what the regulations would allow because of the way that they were tested, and they are trying, and they seemingly have come up with a solution whereby they can resolve this. The problem is that the FIA, they don't want to bring that in immediately because the teams have been designing their front wings now for some time. So the season starts quite shortly. If the FIA are going to say, hey, we've changed the rules, this is what the front wing regulations now look like, the teams will be like, well, hang on a second, we've just spent the last few months designing this front wing and now you're saying it doesn't work anymore. So that's a bit of an issue when the season's about to start. The plan is, it seems, to bring this in somewhere down the line. So the FIA has expressed its opinion on the matter and said further analysis carried out since the end of 2024 has pushed us to ensure that the flexibility of wings will no longer be a bone of contention in 2025. So the teams have been warned about this, and the plan is that it's going to be May 2025, which is quite a long time away, right? We're talking 4 months for the teams to adapt to this. But the regulations are supposedly going to be as follows, because typically it would be, all right, if we bend the wing in this spot, if we bend the wing in this spot, how much does it bend? That was basically the rule. But of course, if you could make it past the static load test, but you could make it flex more than that in race conditions, excellent, that's exactly what the teams are trying to do. But instead, they've now rewritten the rules to say the following: any part of the trailing edge of any front wing flap, So they're basically saying we can now measure this from anywhere. We've not got set positions we're going to measure it from. Anywhere along any of the flaps on the trailing edge of the front wing, we can measure any of these points. And if they deflect, when measured along the loading axis, when a 60 Newton, which is about 6 kilograms, point load is applied normal to the flap, which means perpendicular to the flap, the updated TDF confirmed starts soon. So pretty much, if you place a 6 kilogram weight along any of these elements here on the trailing edge of the any of the front wing flaps, if it deflects by more than 5 millimeters with a 6 kilogram load, then you're cooked. If it doesn't, you're fine. So this seems, I don't know what they normally deflect by, and I'm not going to try and guess, but I think the teams might be all right with this. It's more about just ensuring that there's some consistency in the way that they measure things, which the teams that we weren't so happy about, and that's why it seems McLaren are actually not that unhappy with this, because I think McLaren they've done the development. Now, the wings may therefore get less flexible from May onwards. The teams have time to prepare for it. McLaren have taken advantage of that, and maybe will continue to do so when the season first gets underway, but still, they have the opportunity to maybe still capitalize on those opportunities until other teams may have been well positioned to catch up, at which point the regulations are going to change, or they feel like their front wing might just comply anyway with minimal changes, and there's always going to be some element of flexible wings. The teams are going to look at these new TDs and they're going to say, hey, we can possibly get around that, or we can do this and we can try that, and there will be new development and innovation, and maybe McLaren feel because they were currently ahead of the curve, they may be able to be continually ahead of the curve given the situation. Is it going to help some of the other teams? Ferrari seemingly nearly caught up to where McLaren were by the end of the season in terms of Flexi-Wing development. They, I'm sure, will be not particularly unhappy with the way that this has gone if McLaren are relatively happy with it. It was really Red Bull. They played around with this idea a lot several years ago, then it got banned, and then it turns out you can kind of do it again. So now all of a sudden Red Bull are trying to find their way back into business, and maybe that's what's, maybe going to frustrate them to some degree, who knows. But it is going to be a clarification, so it might be June, it might be mid-May, we'll see. But the clarification initially will be that both wings, the front and rear, must not flex by any more than 10 millimeters. The updated version of TD18 that covers the area of front wing flexibility, which test will be measured, has been drafted. Both wings cannot flex by any more than 15 millimeters. So that apparently is another part of it, that it used to be 15 millimeter flex was allowed in certain instances. It's now 10 millimeter flex, and anywhere along the trailing edge of the lead front wing, then it's 5 millimeters with a 6 kilogram load. So it's all kind of complicated. Until we see the actual way that it's written, we won't be able to fully clarify, but that's what's happening. Who's it going to help? Who's it going to hurt? Intrigued to your thoughts on that in the comments below. And just to close out with our top 2 drivers of the most recent season, of course, Charles Leclerc got second, just ahead of Lando Norris and George Russell in the rankings that race fans did, and then first, of course, went to Max Verstappen, who, despite not having the fastest car for a significant portion of the season, was still good enough to get over the line in this year's championship. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.